last 7 weeks about a lot of technicals and tacticals, but really underpinning all of that tech is really the way that we deliver it, and that's something that you're quite passionate about in terms of its importance.
Yeah, look, I've played at every level, and I've coached it at every level in Ireland, from youths, women, under 18, under 19, AIL, seniors, and so on. So it is something, and then obviously having worked for Leinster in coach and player development, it is something that really started to interest me. Going to assess coaches if they've done their RFU coaching courses, going out to assess them, having a chat with them, and sometimes perception is a funny thing as well, but coaches see themselves in a certain light. We all do, and other people might see you different or challenge you on some of the things. And by no means all the things that we're going to discuss tonight is things that I failed in, is things that I've had success with over the years. And I think that's the nice thing about coaching. There's no one size fits all, but all we want to do is, again, give ideas out there, not this is right. As I say, some players would have coached by me, and I've been true to that. Others, I haven't been true to that, because you try different things the whole time depending on who you have in front of you and circumstances and all of that thing. But what we're going to try and do tonight is give you as much info again on trying to be true to your coaching practice, that it looks a lot like your training looks a lot like when you play.
Absolutely. So, as always, there's a massive amount of content to get through, but we'll just flick over quickly to let you know some of the things that we're going to look at in terms of a brief contents outlook. So, we're going to look at coaching styles. We're going to look at the way in which our players learn. We're going to look at how we maybe measure that learning, early on and throughout the season. We'll look at that real game-based versus drill-based, and how the game is transitioning as such from that traditional drill-based setup into more of a game-based approach.
For me, that's almost going to be the biggest one.
Yeah, and there's a huge amount there, and we'll get Dan to come in as well and maybe provide some insight for us there in terms of how that has transitioned from that traditional playing day of that sort of 80-20 drill game scenario, and how it's developed through from someone who's been there firsthand. We'll look at balance. We'll look at a lot of stuff around session planning, and we'll look at some training, the way we train versus our philosophy versus the game. So there's a lot in that. It's not in that particular order. We'll hopefully get through most of that. As always, in terms of the housekeeping, the chat function is there to throw a question or throw a comment to us. You want to ask a question or jump in at any point, the raise hand button is there. As always, the philosophy here is, myself and Dan aren't experts in any of this. We're just hoping to facilitate a discussion, and hopefully you take a few notes away and you take a few thoughts away from what we discuss. And of course, as Tan said, the way you improve in coaching is challenging. It's people challenging you. That's why me and Dan get on so well, is because we constantly challenge each other, and it's good to have a coaching relationship like that. So feel free to challenge us at any point, and get our opinion on things.
Yeah, during this lockdown, and I've seen a lot of other coaches do it, but we've got a quarantine coaches club every week and so on, where we've challenged each other on all of these things and discussed various things. So it's different from the technical and tactical, where you've got your things that follow on from each other. With the topic that we have tonight, there's no sort of flow to it. But please ask any questions and come in at any time, whether you agree or more importantly disagree.
Absolutely, 100%. That applies for the whole thing and for the whole series, of course. So, I guess what we decided we wanted to open with really was, when we put the word out there about the webinar, the real focus on this evening is the difference between the how and the what. So we thought we'd start by really just sort of making it clear what we mean by that and how we can define that moving forward. So, the what in our coaching, that's all the stuff that can come in underneath that umbrella. So, all our core skills, our tactical stuff, our game maps, our 4 core areas in our attack, defense, transition, and set piece, our game understanding, our DM, our S&C, all of that stuff is really the what. It's the content. It's the bricks and mortar of what we do. It's what builds our identity as a team and what we do and how we coach as well. The how then really, it's how we do it, and not just how we do it, but how we best deliver the what. So the how and the what aren't independent. They're very much interconnected in the sense that when we look at the how this evening, we're looking at how do we best deliver the what. So in the last 7 weeks and moving forward, we will look to develop the what, and that's, we say you can't learn to coach in the classroom. You can learn the technicals and the tacticals, and you can improve your knowledge. This stuff about, learning how to coach is how we best deliver that real technical core content and how we do that best effectively.
But Joe, I think it's also how the how has changed over a number of years. Back 5 to or 10 years time, the how was if we ask anybody to come up with a breakdown drill or passing drill or something like that, they'll know how to coach it. They'll know the key factors, they'll know what to tell the players and so on. But is that the best way to engage with the players? Is that the best learning that takes through the players? The interventions that you make as a coach, is it necessary? How many times? Maybe it's never. And that goes for training and matches. Do you talk before the game to your players in a team speech? Do you rattle on at halftime, or do you let the players decide? So all of those things, that for me is all under the how. And everybody, that's why people are on these things. That's why we go to coaching courses. There's nobody that's 100% on the how to coach. And that's why we look for advice and look around. So we're going to discuss a lot around the how tonight.
Absolutely. That's really good. Thanks for that, Dan. Really gives a core explanation of what we're looking for here. So, myself and Dan are very keen on the philosophy, and it's something that you will hear mentioned on courses and that in terms of having a coaching philosophy, developing a coaching philosophy, and it's something that really is ever developing. As you go through your coaching career, as you interact with different players, different teams, you go through a different period of the season, your coaching philosophy changes. So it's something that isn't rigid. It's something that you need to look at all the time. You'll find that sometimes you'll work with a certain coach for 2 or 3 years. He'll construct your philosophy. You'll work with a different coach, and then by combining all those different minds, you'll start to develop your own belief on things. But really, what we're looking for in that philosophy is it's that most important factor in determining whether what you do in practice is relevant to how you play, because it really is, to an extent, your philosophy is your compass in coaching. It's your blueprint to come back to no matter what. So if at any point you're unsure whether what you're doing is relevant, you're unsure whether you should be doing something different, you're making sure that you are doing the right thing, coming back to your philosophy and seeing if that relates strictly to your philosophy is a good way to keep yourself in check there. And keeping ourselves in check coaching-wise is important. So, those 3 bullet points there really is what we mean by that. So it's a systematic, it's a practical, it's a tangible way to decide how we should act. And how we should act doesn't just mean how we plan our training or how we train. It means the way that we interact with players as well. So in our one-to-one conversations, our philosophy will dictate our culture. So if we're having a one-to-one conversation with a player, the way in which we speak to them, the way in which we convey detail to them, the layer of detail we might give to one player compared to the next, that all comes back to our philosophy. So it really gives us a roadmap of what we want to do coaching-wise.
It's your beliefs, of what you think, how the game should be played. And you've got to tweak that through the season, depending different results or whatever the case may be. But if you can't be true to your coaching philosophy, how's the players going to be true to that? And that is always, if you're a coach that changes 4 or 5 times during the season on the way you believe the game should be played, well, then you're going to lose the players. You can tweak your game plan and all of that, but your integral part of your philosophy stays the same. And again, a simple example is coaches when they get assessed and you ask them, how does your team play? What's your team philosophy? No, we play heads-up rugby. Heads-up rugby is what we play. And then you or delve a little bit deeper and you say, okay, but so if you're in your own 22, what are you going to do? No, we're going to kick the ball. But you just told me you're going to play heads-up rugby. So that for me is a simple example, but it's going against your coaching philosophy. So there must be guidelines towards that, and for you to stay true to it, otherwise your players is never going to stay true.
Absolutely. So you should really, a core point to consider is, your players should be able to recite the majority of your coaching philosophy for you without you present, is the way I would define it. Your players should be able to write down, not even in the right words, obviously, but your players should have a rough understanding of your philosophy, because ultimately your philosophy dictates the way you play if we're keeping to that. So we thought what we do is, those that were on our attack webinar would have seen it already. We're going to come back to them. We're not going to spend any time on them now. We're going to come back and have a brief look at them later. We just wanted to show you kind of what our philosophies on attack look like, just as a roadmap, really, in terms of how we come back to it. So it really just gives you a point of difference, and it gives you something to consider constantly, to use as a reference point whenever you might need to come back to and have a look at it. So we'll come back to those later when we look at a point of similarity between the two, but we just thought you'd give you an example. It's one thing as well that if you want to get in touch with us, if you're defining your coaching philosophy, it's something that me and Dan would have worked with people before in terms of helping develop their coaching philosophy. So if you're developing yours, you want to have a chat about, that's something that we can talk with any of you individually on as you go through, and obviously with everyone else.
Just on Graham's point there, that he's got part of the chat, personally, and again, different coaches, different strengths. Some coaches are really about periodization and planning. I know Joe probably is like that as well, but for me, Graham, I wouldn't periodize technical and tactical a lot. I would during pre-season. But then it's really from week to week. There's certain things that I would like to that I would know that we need to spend more time on or less time on, depending on where we are at. But I certainly wouldn't be one for periodization technically or tactically.
Just to define there, Dan, so I was going to jump in there, just because I know all of you can't see Graham's question. Graham's question that just came in there for us was our beliefs based on, do we periodize and plan what we're covering versus that firefighting approach of training things that have gone wrong. So that's just the question Dan was answering there. But just in terms of periodization, I mean, I touched very briefly on it. Dan said, I'd probably be more planning in the pre-season in terms of what we do. The time that I would look to really periodize is when you have that downtime. So that 2-week gap between game 7 and game 8 is a real important time to periodize, because it's time to get away from you.
Yeah, it's almost a refocus.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, what we just look at briefly here is, well, Dan spoke there quite briefly about, how do we stay true to our philosophy? Because, if we have a philosophy, there's no point in having it unless we're really reinforce that all the time. And I mean, the thing to be clear on is, we don't always have to be 100% true to it, in the sense that it's easy to sometimes compromise your philosophy without realizing it. There's times where, you will actually say something contrary to your philosophy. You might say something that is, you might have a discussion that contradicts it. The core point is that you always come back to it, and then if you do change your view on it, then you adjust that philosophy as you go along. It's a roadmap, really. It's not a rule book, is how I would define your philosophy there. It's a way to kind of bring yourself back to it. So, I mean, when we look at your philosophy impacting your training, every activity that we should do should be really meaningful. So even if we're just doing a little warm-up, a little backyard game to start off, we have that meaning, that purpose behind it. So no matter what we do, you should always be able to ask yourself or ask the person running it, what's the reason for doing it? And if they say it's just to bring a bit of fun in, that's absolutely fine. If they have a technical point, that's fine. But being aware of what we're going for is important. Representative of your play style. So there's no point in us doing, a 15v15 game where we have to offload after every tackle if we have a no offloads policy. So what we do should be relevant to our philosophy, coherent with your philosophy around the role of the individual within the collective. So what I mean by that is, if you play quite a rigid structure where you have, 1-3-3-1 like we spoke about in our attack, you have the same 2 guys that started the pod, well then, why are we spending time getting these guys to replicate these particular scenarios where they're not going to be doing them on the game day? Same in the opposite of that. If we're playing like a nice free-flowing game, we want those guys to be experiencing the same roles that they'll experience on a match day, and not just limiting them to certain roles. Relevant to your player group. So copy versus create is something that me and Dan will talk about a lot. You can go onto YouTube and you can go onto all these coaching resources, go to coaching courses and get drills and games, and they're really useful. But the way I would look at it, and I'd say Dan would agree, is to look at it and use that to create your own version, or use it, create your own brand of a drill or a game that you can use. Because ultimately, you want to have full understanding of every single reason behind every part of that drill or game, so that you can really focus on it. So copying versus creating, when we look at our session content, is important. Copying is fine if it's relevant, but understanding why we're copying it.
That's the same in understanding. A lot of coaches see the top coaches in the world, take it when the 1-3-3-1 and 2-4-2 came out. Everybody tried to copy it without understanding it. Now they start to understand it better, so it works better. The Eddie Jones's way, the Heineke Meyer way in South Africa, the Stuart Lancaster way. Everybody tries to copy those sort of coaches, but they don't understand the reason why those coaches are doing it. So if something goes wrong, you can't fix it because it's somebody else's. So you've got to try and relate that to your own way.
Absolutely. And then that last one is something we're going to touch on briefly, which is having everything targeted, and it is interlinked with that meaningful point there. But having everything targeted means that we're very clear on what we're trying to improve. So if I put 8 of us in this room into a passing drill, I want all 8 of you to know within the first 30 seconds what we're trying to improve. So are we trying to go in and get good at moving the ball across the face really quickly? Are we trying to get good in terms of having really good technique across the front? So being clear on our targets is important. So just to kind of illustrate that, it's something that Danza came up in our coaches club there last week. Employee and employer, how you doing on your objectives? Which ones? Are the ones I've made up in my mind? Yeah, I'm absolutely nailing those ones. So, it's funny because players will give you that answer. If we can't expect players to really just understand instantly what we're looking for. They won't understand exactly what we're targeting all the time. So providing the players with a real clear roadmap of what we're trying to improve makes a massive, massive difference because it does keep us targeted and on track. And that's the same for us as coaches as well. Make sure we understand why we're doing what we're doing and what improvement that's going to make. So just something we're going to touch on briefly. We said we'd touch on the player learning styles. And the one on the left here really is something that probably the majority of you would have encountered at some point in terms of those traditional learning styles of visual, auditory, kinesthetic. So visual being, things that we look at, auditory being things we hear, and kinesthetic being things we do. So that sort of one on the left there is a real generic version for learners in general. And then on the right-hand side there, we've just sort of illustrated what that might look like in a rugby-specific context. So from a visual perspective, if we have visual learners, can we provide playbooks to them? Can we provide analysis videos, principle sheets? So, for a line-out, we'll have a drill sheet, which would be, in the 22s, we write down on a Word document. In the 22s, we do this 5-man, and this line-out, we do this 3-man, this 4-man. So, those learning styles are accounted for. In terms of auditory, team meetings, can we have them in meetings where we define things that maybe they wouldn't understand from a visual context? Can we put voiceovers over our video analysis for those guys that need that experience? And then from a kinesthetic point of view, walk through. So getting out even with just 4 or 5 guys and walking through your lineouts, getting out in your full 15 and walking through your shape, your principles, your one-to-one primers. So if you really need to get a guy to understand the core factor in the tackle, can we take him for a one-on-one for 5 minutes before the session? So the consideration for all of those put together is how can we look to consciously understand how we're providing for all 3 of these in our training week. So providing for all 3 in one session or one day can be somewhat unrealistic depending on the environment you're in. But can we account for these all 3 learning styles in 1 week is what we're really looking for. In a training block, can we account for all of them?
And players could be accountable themselves,
Absolutely.
Like everybody these days have got a senior group of players. There's new guys coming to your club now in September or hopefully when we start. How do you integrate them? How do they get used to the different plays? How do you know that player in that system, So don't try and do everything. Delegate and let senior players take that role as well.
And all of those elements there, to an extent, really can be done on your own. You can read your playbooks on your own. You can listen to those voiceovers on your own. You can do your little one. You can do individual work. There's very few skills in the game of rugby that you can practice to at least some extent on your own. So we can provide ownership to the players on those extents. So just to touch briefly, one thing, Dan, we thought we'd touch briefly on was on that questioning approach, because we're not going to spend too much time on it because it obviously is a consistent theme through the modern coaching landscape. But this is something that you would have provided a lot of detail on in the coaching course surrounding that closed question versus open questions, and as well as that, how we vary our language. So we're not just using the same, do you, do I, the whole time. We're really trying to vary up our language here in terms of giving people an opportunity to prove their learning or request more information that they're not quite there yet.
Yeah, it's a very difficult skill to get used to if you haven't done it before. I think every coach that starts off is a telling coach, because you take the information that you've learned as a player and you try and put it to the players that you coach now. But again, what learning do they take out of that? So through experience and so on, I'm a massive believer in questioning. We've always been challenged on, but when can you start questioning players, and then some guys will say, no, 16 years of age is a good age. That's too late, and I use the thing is, when my son was 4 years old or 3 years old, if I give him Rice Krispies or Wheat Bix in the morning and I put it down in front of him, he'll probably give it back to me and say, I don't want that. If you ask him, what would you like for breakfast? He's got the ability to make a decision what he wants and takes learnings from that. So for me, now I relate that to rugby. Is the first time they set foot on the rugby field. That's when you can start asking them questions. Obviously, the depth of your question and all of that will change over the years, but coaching through questioning, I think, is a massive part, and still a lot of coaches that tell coaches out there. The closed questions provide no room for query. Real Irish phrase, probably. Happy with that? And 30 blokes say, yes, we're happy with that, and they haven't got a clue what you just spoke about, So that closed versus open question. And to get you used to questioning, probably good to start with closed questions, but then try and have the open questions. And it's not just to put it back on the player the whole time, but I do think, because sometimes the player wants some information from you. So, and that's again where you've got to know that, okay, now it's the time to tell them what I think. But I think if you can ask more open questions, you'll empower the players more. That will encourage them to make better decisions on the pitch as well.
Absolutely, and we're not going to touch, very specifically on language later on, but the one point that I'll make on that, just from my experience over the last few years, is when we look at communicating with players and we question and we interact with players on this, varying our tone, varying our state of emotion, varying our body language, and that is a really powerful tool with players. And we don't have to feel like we have to have, I've had some session plans come out before, and they're very good when you're a new coach, which is some coaches will produce a session plan, and when they're starting out, they'll put down 4 or 5 different questions they could ask. So they'll have, a 4x4 passing drill, and they'll have 4 or 5 different questions that they could prompt in. And that's a good way to get used to coaching, to questioning as we go through coaching. But really varying your tone, really being emotive and connecting with players around these things. With that third question, if I say that in a really fast, abrupt manner, well, explain that again. Guys are going to go, oh, he doesn't really have time. He doesn't want to know. Really having the time to look guys in the eye, really relate to them, know that you're speaking to them, know that you're speaking with emotion. That's going to make a massive difference in the quality of your questioning as well. So really varying the tone and the way you question as well is important, not just the questioning itself. So, this is a concept I thought I'd touch on briefly, which is something that, anyone who's involved or has been involved in business before will be aware of. It's something very common in the business world around the golden circle. So, you can read all that there, you can take a screenshot of it. If you look up the golden circle on Google, you'll find plenty on it. It just really explains how the majority of organizations, and including the sports teams, and that has been conveyed very deeply to sports teams recently, the majority of all our organizations know what they have to do. So we know that we have to play a very fast brand of rugby. What we do, we have a rough understanding of how we're going to do that, the ways in which we're able to do that. What we struggle to do is we struggle to understand why we're doing it. And the belief that I would hold behind this is that, when we get that understanding and clarity on why we do things, we're able to work from the inside out with a lot more ability and confidence than we are able to work from the outside in. Because when we work from the why first, then we're able to slowly develop the skills, all the while knowing the purpose. Try to do anything with a complex task or complex nature in your life without knowing why you're doing it, and see how frustrated you get. If you go down and you're just told, I want you to go and clean out all that stuff in that room. Why? Just do it. You'll be a lot more frustrated than if you were told, oh, we're going to put a new TV in that room, or we're going to make this into a new sitting room. When you understand the why, the action becomes much more relatable and much more enjoyable to an extent, because you know why you're doing it. That comes back to every rugby example.
And that is probably why to have the why as we have to win is probably not a good thing.
Yeah.
Because how are you going to do that, and what takes you there?
Well, we've illustrated an example here. So if you look, we've just taken that really clear example that I've mentioned there in the black box at the top. So we're going to play at a higher pace than any other side. This in the last 3 or 4 years is a really, really common philosophy behind teams. It's sort of ironic in a sense that, you know, if you're in a team with 8, if you're in a league with 9 other teams, there's a fair chance 7 of them are saying they're going to play faster than everyone else. So, you know, a lot of teams have this focus. I mean, Scotland built their entire World Cup campaign around playing faster than everyone else. That's just the way Gregor Townsend views the game. But again, that's his philosophy, and he coaches through that. So, I mean, this is a really good tool that I'd highly recommend to you, and it's something you can do in your mind as well. You don't have to put it all on paper and drill it out. So, I mean, if you just look at that briefly there, like we said, you know, we look to have these Dora the Explorer moments on these as well, where I put it up for you and let you think about it while I ramble on for a second. You know, what's the what in this? What's the how and what's the why? So, as a player, if I gave you that sentence, you're going to instantly know the what because I've just told you. The difficulty for us as coaches is understanding the how and the why. So, if we fill those in there, so the green, we're using the traffic light system again. So the green, what we're doing is we're playing at a high tempo. We have a real clear understanding of that because I've just told you. You don't have to know anything about rugby, but if I tell you we're going to play fast, you understand that concept. Then we work to that sort of that amber level of understanding. How do we do that? So if I ask a complete amateur, how do we play at a high tempo? You're probably going to get an answer like run faster. Or anything like that. But we develop through the understanding of players, you know, how we do that. We've good work on the floor, we present well, we've good efficient clear outs, we do our work early at the breakdown. That why is where our challenge is as coaches. Because the why behind that one would be by playing at a high tempo, we target that organised defence and we execute before they can react. So that is where the why in that is. So the challenge as coaches for us is to work in this red why zone, because if we can get that clarity on why we do things, getting guys bought into how and what we do is much easier. The what we can take for given, because as long as you have clear communication on what you've just said, the what is a given. The challenge for us is then to go to the why and establish clarity and connect players to the why. So there's no point in telling guys, listen, we're going to play at a high pace, and they don't understand the impact that will have on the game. We want to connect them to that why, because as a subsequent point of that red box there, if we play at a high tempo, if we target an organised defence, and if we hit them before they can react, then you score tries, then you win games. So you connect the why to the end goal and the end result. People want to win in most levels. Most teams that we speak about, and the coaches of most teams in this room want to win. So we connect the why to the end result and the end goal, and we want to try and do that consistently. It's not just a one-off. We really want to keep reinforcing that message throughout the year and throughout the season. So, I mean, as we look through here, it's just a brief point that I thought we'd look at again, another sort of business-related concept here, the learning pit. It's another thing I'd really recommend that you have a look into. So you've got these 4 stages of the learning pit here. So, I mean, a really easy example you could look at here is, you know, myself and Dan will coach our players to pass with the ball above the hips. You know, pass in a real positive position because it gives you the ability to do more. A lot of players, especially at international level, are taught or naturally bring the ball below hip height. So with those guys, you know, are naturally able to do that. With our lower level players, we have to change some habits to get them more capable. A really easy example of that here is where we're communicating to a player, listen, I want you to pass the ball above your hips. So, I mean, that point number 1 on that graph there is where they get the concept. So point 1 is concept. So the concept is what we tell them. I want you to pass the ball above your hips. Then part 2 there is we go from clarity into a sense of confusion a lot of the time. That's what we call cognitive conflict. So you can look this all up. You don't have to scramble it all. So cognitive conflict. So that's where they conflict the idea that you gave them with the idea that they already have. So they believe in what you told them, and they believe in what they already do. So you're creating conflict between those 2 beliefs in the player. That third one there is construction. So we construct meaning. So we make them understand why that's important. So we construct meaning by saying, by doing this, it gives you the ability to pass left, pass right, offload, kick, play a little pop to the inside or outside. We construct that understanding of why we do it. And then as we move from 3 to 4, we get to this eureka moment. And that moment there is where the players go, oh, I understand why we do this now. I understand the meaning and the purpose of it. And then more importantly, and almost most importantly, is that they reflect on how they got there. So they reflect that process of taking in the idea, processing it, working with it and trying it out. Because once they've done that once or twice, they become much more coachable players. So when we often say, you know, geez, that player's uncoachable, well, that's where we have to come back to maybe 1 or 2 core ideas and really bringing them through that 4C stage in the learning pit and getting them to experience that eureka moment. And we'll talk about how many decisions we make in training, but ultimately the more eureka moments or the more aha moments that our players can get in a training session or in a week or in a season, the smarter they get. Because ultimately that learning that goes on in their head, where they have that aha moment, that is much more valuable and much deeper connected than anything we can tell them. So that's a really, really important part of that process that maybe is defined in a slightly more logical way than we would have discussed before. So just to make a brief touch on coaching style. So, I mean, we can have a look at all these different ways that we coach. So we've got, conscientious, dominance, steadiness, and influence. So this is a really common graph. You'll see it anywhere you look it up. The point that we want to reinforce here really is, and we both know this being coach educators, that you're never going to be at one corner. So you're never going to be purely on that influence bottom right corner or that conscientious top left corner. We fall somewhere in the mix of those. And that will often be done in sort of a spider diagram out to see how much of each graph, how much of each box that you control. Just being aware of how that influences things. So, I mean, if you look there on that right-hand side, post the arrow, direct, faster, and pace, the dominant and influence style of coaching is where we really try to push tempo. And we push tempo sometimes through intimidation. We sometimes push it through standards and holding aggressive standards or just bringing energy. So we could look at that and go, there are certain times to employ all of these coaching styles. There's certain times where you're going to have to bring energy. There's certain times where guys are too energetic and you'll have to slow them down.
It's definitely going to differ from season to season, from week to week. There's so many things that's going to influence that.
Just being aware of those and how we can transition between them. And you don't have to say, myself and Dan will never sit down with a coach and say, which of the 4 coaching styles are you? Because you transition and you change, the same as with your philosophy. You just need to understand how. So more importantly than the 4 styles there, it's understanding those 4 little boxes outside, how they influence the way that you manage. So how the 2 on the right end up being faster, how the 2 on the left end up being slower. Just understanding the influence that all of those have.
And then you might see yourself different than what other guys see you. I think a lot of people would have seen me as red at a stage, but I'd like to think I've changed a lot in that. So you develop as a coach throughout as well, and the more conversations you have with more people, finding out what is my strength, what is my weakness. If you coach against somebody, ask him, how did you plan to play against us? Yeah. All of those things. Don't be shy about being open.
Absolutely, and that's just a core point that underpins all of this, really. So, I mean, the way that we act influences the way the players learn. That's a really important point that's sometimes overlooked. The way that you interact with players, the way that you manage the session, the way that you conduct yourself really has a massive impact on the way players learn, because ultimately you're the one in charge, and they'll look to you for guidance, they'll look to you for leadership, they'll look to you for answers. They'll also look to you for your behaviours when things aren't going the way you want them to. So all of these things will influence the quality of learning in the player. So, I mean, we go through those really slowly. What occurs if we allow players to experience the activity with the least correction? So, especially in early parts of the season, putting guys in unstructured, chaotic environments is really helpful because it allows them to self-correct. And ultimately, if we can allow players to try and self-correct and explore first, it does 2 things. Firstly, it allows them to really get used to decision-making and critical decision-making in the moment. Secondly, gives us a real clear understanding as a coaching staff which players need that real work on understanding how to make decisions, and which players need the work on understanding how to execute technically better. So when we look and allow them to discover them first, we can really stand back and look at a global picture of our players and go, which of these guys can get better through self-correction and through working with others, and which guys need that intervention. So especially when we've limited time, those kind of self-correction games are really valuable, especially as we start the season off.
Yeah, it's also to, and I think it comes up later as well. Don't know if it's the right time to buddy now. But it's as well, you don't always have to give the feedback. You can channel the feedback through the players. Get them play some sort of game. 2 minutes in or minute and a half in, not going according to plan. Play A group over there with Joe Blocks, B group over there with Pete. Come up with a plan. How are we going to play this together? Without you're just facilitating the conversation of them trying to come up with a solution and correcting, because ultimately that's what's going to happen on Saturday.
Absolutely, and being aware of that disconnect between, when the players take the field, the amount of influence that you lose when they take the field is an important consideration when we consider how much we interject in training. So I mean, that comes back to Dan's point there. When do we need to give feedback? So at some point, and some points, by stepping in and giving feedback, we're stemming the flow of the play, and by doing that, we're stemming the flow of learning. So the easiest thing for us to do at times, we're trying to get some clarity on a team run. We drop the ball, we blow the whistle, we go again. If we just leave that go and we let that scenario unfold, the game isn't perfect. The game will have those mistakes and will have those screw-ups. By allowing that to unfold, we're giving them that learning experience of reacting to a scenario that we weren't anticipating, or reacting to a scenario that's not desirable. So given that freedom of flow to allow that to happen, and it also comes into that point of sometimes is the error a collective error or individual error. So, if we drop the ball going across the line quite hard or quite fast, we have to really consider, okay, is this a point on, that number 13 put his hands too low and his body shape was poor so we couldn't get it across? Or is it because we shouldn't have got the ball there in the first place because it should have gone over there? So we understand that in our own head and we ask ourselves those questions before we interject. Because if we interject immediately, that's when we can just really stem the flow.
So for me, it's a lot where coaches want to get their knowledge across, and they feel they have to give feedback the whole time. That collective feedback, you might have dropped the ball, a couple of times or 3 times in a row. Now the coach calls everybody in a circle. He dropped the ball. It's got no relevance to all the other players because they didn't drop the ball. So that's where the individual feedback. Coach was better off pulling the individual aside, coaching him, why do you think you dropped the ball? Well, I did this, or I did this, or I don't know. And then you give him the advice. So sometimes we feel we must always bring the collective in. There is going to be times if there's a theme that's happening the whole time, then by all means. But I think we've got to get used to, as coaches, to coach the individuals more. And that's probably the next one as well, the peer coaching and coach-led. You don't always have to coach. There's other guys that can coach. You guide them towards that.
Absolutely. So I mean, just in that sense, there's hot and cold feedback. Your hot feedback is in the moment as it's happening, just after it's occurred, while it's fresh in the mind. Your cold feedback is either off the pitch or after you finished your reps and you've gone for your water, you can come in and have a discussion. I mean, that hot feedback, especially when you have multiple coaches, individual one-to-one feedback when you're resetting the rep or resetting the drill is so valuable.
We all coach at different levels, and a lot of time we've said, geez, these numpties can't even remember, what happened 30 seconds ago, never mind 2 minutes ago. So you do a drill for 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes, and then you get them for collective feedback and want to give it. Coach the player in the moment. The other important part there for me will be your positioning as well. To be able to give that individual feedback and coach that individual the whole time, you need to work on your positioning. Depending the activity that you do, if it's a tactical game that you're playing, don't be scared to run around, trying to get into the ear of the player. It might be through saying something to him, or it might be to draw something out of him. But give the individual information the whole time. That would be personally what I would have changed a lot over the years.
Absolutely, and Martin just came in with a question there about co-coaching, and Dan, we're going to look at that in a few minutes just in terms of team coaching. But I mean, utilising your resources as a staff, especially as you move up the levels, it's really valuable in terms of just having the ability to split up the workload. Because as we said, we don't have the ability to see everything, and the biggest one of the biggest weaknesses I think for coaches starting out their career, starting out their coaching, is they feel like they have to be able to see everything and give feedback to everything and run everything. Delegating that responsibility or being able to share that responsibility with others is really valuable.
But on that as well, when I used to go out and assess coaches, and you come there and there's 3 coaches there, and then the one guy that's being assessed, he does everything on the night. He refs the touch game, he does this, he does that, and afterwards when you ask him, why did you do it? No, but I'm getting assessed. But you've got a coach in that trio that you have, like you say, the ideal scenario will probably be, I look after the breakdown. So I run the activity while you coach the players in that activity. And there's another coach that might give individual feedback. Just now, you coaching handling, you coach the activity, I coach the player within that. And that's the delegation and the understanding with coaches. It's like in a game, half time, or if you watch a game, if all three coaches watches the game the same way, then you're not going to get any new views. One coach might just watch the ball. Another coach might just watch the outside channels, that sort of thing. And then before halftime, you come together and you discuss. So very much delegation, but everybody coach together.
Absolutely. And we'll touch on that briefly. So, I mean, Dan, this is one you got a good laugh out of. I mean, just, you know, I nearly put Dan's head on the dog.
My selfie.
I nearly put Dan's head on the dog when I was putting this up. But, I mean, you know, it's a core part of coaching. I mean, you know, as I said, using tone to make a difference. I mean, one of the biggest criticisms for Stuart Lancaster when he was a young coach was that he didn't vary his tone. That, you know, players didn't know when he was annoyed with the situation. He didn't know when he was happy with it. He didn't vary his emotions in that. And sometimes we can feel like we have to be stern and we have to be controlled as the coach because we're the one in charge. You know, varying your emotions is something that is very valuable. And look, you know, we do often end up looking like this. You know, my point would be the more you do this, you know, maybe the more you need to take a look at the way you're coaching, because the way I would view it is the way when you act like this, you lose the ability to give feedback. So when you get into that, you know, if you get into this kind of zone of coaching, it's good to maybe prompt some focus. It's good to maybe prompt some action from the players. You know, really get them up if there is a lack of focus. But channeling when and how often and how frequently we do this is when it packs power. So I'm not saying we don't do this, because I mean all of us do it. It's about knowing when and to what point and to what extent we do it and what impact is it going to have.
Definitely, and I don't want to come across wrongly here, but I've coached with guys, I've been in that same boat, guys that were very good players, and then they find it very difficult to understand why players can't catch a ball. And it actually, you know, had a big influence on their negative coaching for that matter, because they just couldn't relate. But it was so easy to do when we played. Why does these players struggle with it? And in that sense, it's sometimes a lot easier for guys that haven't played at a higher level or played at all to become good coaches, because they don't have to deal with that factor. But I totally agree with you, and I think again, time is a wonderful thing. You know, over the years, you've got to try and mellow as a coach, I would say.
I'd say so, yeah. And I mean, this is the point that we want to make on that. So energy is infectious, and it's something that I all hear. You know, I say it on repeat, especially when I'm working with different and new coaches. You know, players will act the way that you act, because you, at the end of the day, are the leader of the group. You're responsible for the way that the team play. You're responsible for the actions, for the style, for the belief, for the culture. So the way in which you act is the way the players are going to act. So as I said, you know, if you get angry and you get aggressive, you lose the ability to give feedback. If your players are seeing that all the time, they're more likely to do that on the pitch and therefore lose the ability to make good tactical decisions. So the way that you act is going to influence the player. So players are going to try and emulate the way you act. If you're on the sideline trying to scream on feedback, trying to tell what to do, trying to be really assertive and aggressive, what real impact are you going to have there compared to if you wait for the right moment to get on and give that piece of feedback at the right time, and it gives that real feeling of calm and control. I mean, the scenario that me and Dan would often speak about is, you know, if you're in that 75th minute and you need to score to at least draw the game, you know, everything in your brain is telling you to scream the play onto the pitch, to tell them what to do. At the end of the day, what they're looking for from you as a player group is calm, controlled, logical decision making, and rational activity. So by doing that, you're conveying that, and the impact that rational, real, calm thought and action will have on the player group is massive. Because it reassures them that it's not a scenario to be panicking about.
And depending where you coach as well, you know, about development, you know, I was involved with underage, to give a prime example. Guys ended up playing for Ireland. But, you know, last play of the game against Munster, did something or lined up the back line as we never lined up, never practiced it, never. He just had a moment. You know, we ended up losing the game. I could have easily shouted onto the field, no, do this, do that. But again, the player wouldn't have learned from that and so on. So it's all part of their learning curve as well. And don't confuse energy with I've got to be the man the whole time. Like you say there, calm also plays a huge part.
Absolutely. And I mean that's the picture that some of us might be familiar with. It did the rounds on Twitter, Reece. That's Sean McVeigh, one of the youngest coaches in the NFL, actually, and he got quite famous for having a keep me back coach, because he was so constant to try and get onto the field, and he was so energetic that he was always trying to get onto the field, and he has one of his coaches dedicated to purely holding them back. But if you haven't seen it,
there's a few coaches like that around.
Yeah, I'm like that for Dan. But no, I mean, like if you just look it up on YouTube, and it's funny because as a feature or as an explanation of really controlling your emotions on a game day, it's an interesting look into the coaching world professionally. But as we said there, we've restrained from negative impacts, we're restrained from getting on and cursing and effing and blinding about things. It's also restrained from constructively intervening all the time. So do we always need to get in and give feedback? So as error occurs, we allow it to evolve. So let that error occur, evolve to the point where it either fixes itself, or after it happening a multiple amount of times on a global scale with the team, then we might have to allow that error to take it to really take its course. So if we're having a problem with our angles of running off 10, say, allow that to occur a few times and see if the players will self-correct. See if the guy who's running the line is going to realise, well, actually, I'm way too narrow because I'm getting smashed all the time. Allow that to evolve, because as we said there with that learning pit, if they have that eureka moment themselves, that learning and the connection with that experience and that development is going to be much deeper than you jumping in and giving them the information for them and even questioning them on that extent.
And again, I think you can relate that back to the game as well. During halftime, how many coaches go in and intervene straight away? Can't wait to get in there and tell the players what to do. Yeah. Where a better process might be, split them off in groups. Mini units. Mini units go off for 30 seconds or 45 seconds, get a feel of and talk to each other. Then units go and talk to each other, and then coaches come in. And if it hasn't been addressed by the players, then there is probably a problem of how you've played so far. But most often, in my experience, you might come up with one new thing, but by the time you address the players at halftime, they've actually addressed all the issues themselves, know how the opposition defend, know how we should play, what went right, what went wrong. And another story was Graham Henry. Tana Umaga came into his office one morning and when he coached the All Blacks, and he said, "Look, are you going to give us the speech before the game again?" And Graham said, "Yes, I am." And he says, "Well, what is that? What's that going to help us as players? And we the ones playing, so you don't have to charge us up before the game and so on." And since then, the All Blacks for a long time didn't have any speeches. And I mean, I did that with own teams that I coach. There's no team talks before the game anymore. Yeah. It's the players. It's players led, and they go and play.
Absolutely. So, I mean, just we're going to touch on this really briefly. We've loads to get through here. I know we're conscious about the session planning stuff that was requested. So, I mean, in terms of team coaching, that just comes back to that point that came up there, Martin, in terms of our team coaching. So, the easiest habit, as Dan said, for us to fall into is watching the ball. We all watch the ball and we all do the same thing. So, where we can, that 3T approach is really useful. So, the total. So run the activity and really ensure that we get continuity and we're not getting lag time and break time all consistently between reps. The technical is in terms of observing and the real technical aspects. So the catch pass, the breakdown, the tackle, really observing the technical. Then the tactical there is where we can observe the tactical end of the game. So, if we're running a 15v15 game, easiest example, total is refereeing, technical is looking at the catch pass, the breakdown, the tackle. The tactical is looking at how well do we align and attack, how good is our spacings in defence. And then, you're looking, as Dan said, to really bring those three together then as a coaching staff. And if we can, if the facility is there, if players are if we're doing that 15v15, let's get those players to go for a quick 30-second water break. Let's all come in as a 3 or a 4 or a 5 and have a real quick conversation on what our core takeaways are before we go to the players. It's going to be immensely valuable. So this is something that, is really core to what a lot of stuff that Dan would have coached in the coaching courses before. We speak about it a lot on our coaching course. Constraints-based coaching, that's just really the definition of it there. So it's really about using games and activities that make players use particular techniques or strategies to win. It's all about, making things competitive and training where we can. So telling them telling them what they need to do to win and letting them find their way, really. So that's what constraints-based coaching is. And the way we kind of look at that on a more technical note is really under the 3 R's. So the 3 R's here really is our restrict, our relate, and our reward. So these are the kind of things that you may have came across in coaching courses before. So restrict, it's using rules, our personnel, our parameters. So a 3-pass rule, a smaller or bigger pitch size, to really restrict the actions of the players within the game and establish a real particular game condition within that activity. Then relate is creating a scenario which is really relatable to the player. So it creates a link between what we're doing and the game and challenges them within that. So we don't want to create a really slow activity that is related to the game but doesn't relate to the pace of the game or doesn't challenge the player. And then finally, that reward. So modifying the reward for actions and outcomes. So create satisfaction. At the end of the day, rugby, to a massive extent, like sport, it's about winning. Vince Lombardi said if sport isn't about winning, then why do they keep score? So, at the end of the day, regardless of what level you're at, guys want to go out and win. So, create competitiveness and create, happiness with winning and targets. And, sometimes that means, losing teams with 20 burpees. That creates a bit of fun with the guys. They get in each other's faces and it creates competitiveness. But coming out the side of those 3 R's is the progressions, and it's something that we're really passionate about in the way that we coach. In terms of, the tendency, especially when you're developing your coaching, and during this heavy CPD period for a lot of people, is it's building up this 500-page coaching manual of all these drills and games. Where if we have a progression, which is the ability to just work on multiple things within one activity, it's immensely valuable and very, very valuable for us as a coaching staff to keep things moving forward. So could we build one activity, so one set of parameters, one set of pitch size, one set of rules that we can then develop and change based on the outcome that we want? So can we have one activity in one grid that we can change based on what we want to get out of it? So, for example, we're just going to throw up a really easy example of it here. How could we build 3 progressions from a really simple 4x4 passing drill? So when I say a 4x4 passing drill, that could be known as a domino drill. 4 players between cones, 10 meters out, 4 more players between cones, and we just pass the ball across the line. Last man passes to the far side and we come back. So that's, a real generic one. It's probably one of the first drills you'll see when you play or coach. It just gives you clarity. So how do we progress that is what we're just going to take a brief look at. So it's not a gospel, it's just an example how we can do this. So, here's an easy example. So here's that domino drill or that 4x4 drill. 2 cones, even spacings. Quick note for me, technically, from coming from a skills background perspective, if you have that 4x4 drill, just place the 2 cones at 2 cones rather than 4 and 4. Get guys used to understanding spacings. So within those parameters, they're not going to have cones in front of them in a game. So yes, use cones if you want to provide the understanding of the width of the grid, but leave them understand and get used to the spacings within that. So get them into even spacings there, 4x4, and we're just going across the line. So that's our really easy initial start. So then our next progression is we can do it on both sides. We can be coming off the left from both sides, going at the same time. So we're going from core isolated skill to core skill with a little bit of pressure. So the pressure being, there's a guy running just left of my channel. I've got to make sure that I get my hands up, that if the ball goes behind him, I'm really ready for it. I have to be aware of where this guy is now to make sure I don't hit him when I'm passing. So we're adding in an element of pressure aside from the core skill. Then can we push it on again? So we're still within the same drill, still within the same focus. This time we just have, when we set up our 4 cones, we have 2 more cones, 5 to 10 meters further out, depending on the level you're coaching. And all we do is we come back to the core focus of passing without the pressure, just with a wider pass. So we haven't changed the activity. All we've done is we've just widened the grid. So we haven't moved, we haven't transitioned, we haven't changed the focus. We've just widened our pass. So same thing, same principle. We've just widened it. Now, obviously we do this off both sides as well, both sides of the hand.
Just as we progress, and very important point to the progression. But I think something that we can also do is regress. Where you start with the most difficult, and if they can do it, happy days. We always assume, look, they're going to struggle to do this, so we have to have some progressions. But I think as coaches, we should challenge ourselves by regressions as well. Start at the most difficult. If they can do it, well, then that's your eureka moment. If they can't do it, then you bring it back to build it up again.
Absolutely, and that's again challenging us to be adaptive in the moment as well as coaches. So I mean, we're going back to the same principle. So there's our third progression. So we've done the same. So we've got a core isolated skill in a short pass. We've added pressure. Then we've widened the core skill pass and we've applied pressure. So being aware of how we can develop that within the same grid just really limits the transitions. Just having those players in that one grid. The real point that I'll make on that, and we'll go into transitions really briefly, is that the more time that we have to spend explaining the drill to the player, the less time, the less focus they can have on getting better at what is in it. So what in the drill is the core skill we're working on. So the longer we have to spend explaining this is how we do this drill because it's completely different to how we did it on Tuesday, is less time working on that skill. So I mean, just to really summarize that, we place the focus on a set parameter and an activity. So we have a 15 by 15 grid with a minimum of 8 players, and we're focused on our pass. So we can just have that as our parameter. Then the challenge for us as coaches then is to figure out how can we work out multiple progressions and regressions, as Dan said, that can happen within those parameters. So rather than doing, those drills as well, and this is, something that we're really passionate about, is rather than just doing drills for the sake of drills, we're trying to see how far we can continue to challenge the players within that, because it also does develop an extent of confidence that the players can see themselves progressing and going through a more difficult layer of detail, where if we constantly jump from drill to drill, that feeling of satisfaction of getting better at it isn't present. So if we can get guys to get really satisfied of building detail in and building difficulty, that really helps us out there. And that obviously, like I said, affects our transition times.
And try and coach without cones.
Yeah, exactly. The less cones, Eddie Jones doesn't coach with cones, but obviously they are, the less we can use, the better. But again, that comes back to the activity and your focus. But I mean, we're just going to touch really briefly on transition times because they are an important part of our session planning. So the transition time for us is the time taken to go from one activity to the next, which includes obviously, stopping for a bit of feedback, stopping for water, stopping for a breather. Those are all transitions. So managing our transition times is often the marker of how close you are to game scenario. So if it takes 40 seconds from when a penalty is awarded to when the line out occurs, we don't want you don't want a 2-minute transition from when we do rep to rep. So keeping our transition time relative is really powerful. So how do we best manage them? So deciding in advance how many huddles we're going to do, that's a really valuable tool. That's really something that we can do. And it's something that's not done a lot, but it's something that we can do. Taking our water breaks close to where we're going to go to our next station, something really valuable as well. We don't want to have our drill up on one end of the pitch, run down for water, walk all the way back. We've lost 3 or 4 minutes there. Having our stuff planned in terms of where on the pitch it's going to be and close proximity, really valuable. As well as that, minimizing our total transitions by using progressions. So can we do a 90-minute training session with 4 different activities that are all just progressing, so we don't have to move around and move cone time? I always say, obviously you've limited resources as a coach, but if you can get into the ability where you don't have to pick up and move cones or pick up and move equipment during a session, you can just flow from one to one. That's a sign of a really good understanding of transitions. But again, that does obviously come back to your ability and your resources. So just coming back to the philosophies. So this is the philosophies we had a look at earlier. One thing that's consistent through myself and Dan's philosophies is the importance of decision making, because it is really the core of what we do in every game. So we thought we'd just use this as an opportunity to illustrate how we incorporate decision making.
And for me, it's everybody making decisions, not just your so perceived decision makers to be. Like if you do a decision making drill, there's a lot of coaches out there. They do a simple 5v3. If the prop wants to go into first receiver, they actually get him out of there. That's not your place. Where I'll actually encourage that, because the way I want the game to be played, that guy is going to be at first receiver during the game, probably at 2 or 3 times. So it's putting everybody in that decision-making process, not just a numbered few.
Absolutely, and creating as many decision makers as possible ultimately is how we become a multi-stage and multi-layered threat. So I mean, this is just something that we thought we'd use to illustrate, how much decision making is present in the game. So you look at that there and you go, okay, well there's a lot of decisions that could evolve in an attacking structure.
And then there's probably more.
Yeah, but I mean, and what I'm just going to make is this is just the decisions for one player off 9. So all we've illustrated here is all the different decisions that can be made by one player who's standing at first receiver off the run. So that this isn't, an attacking structure, a shape, or a progression, or a set of phases. Those are all the different decisions that can be made by a player just standing off 9. So sometimes we can underestimate that. We can get quite pent up as coaches, and as we said, we can interrupt quite negatively sometimes, especially for those of us that haven't played at that level, being aware of how many decisions that have to occur in such a short period of time, it makes us really aware of how difficult it can be.
So you as a coach needs to have the ability then to relate to that player straight away, or to give him a cue that he knows. Like, say for instance, the stance. How many players do we get that stand wrong? So you've got to have a trigger that you can give to him straight away, that he realizes, look, I can do this better, or whatever the case in any of the other aspects as well.
Absolutely. And this is just what we've used to illustrate that. So, if you look at the attacking team there, player B for ball, how many times in training has that player experienced and reacted to that scenario? If you look at that piece of play, that's a really, really common piece of play and playoff 9 that you'll see in a game. But how often have you allowed that player to get into a situation where he's had an active defence in front of him, they've changed angle, it's slightly disconnected due to their fatigue around the corner, and how many times have we given him the opportunity to get familiar with that? Because the more times we get that player familiar with that scenario, the more likely it is he can make a better decision.
Look how many different decisions he can make there. Yeah. And through his decision that he's got to make, or that he can make, you challenge the support players as well. What aren't you offering him? You're taking a decision away from him that he could have done if your positioning or your effectiveness was better. So actually in that snapshot, there's a hell of a lot of coaching that can take place.
Absolutely. And just a real visual way to illustrate that.
Just on Martin's question there in the group, Martin is saying, one train of thought when designing sessions, drills, skills, design the problem, don't prescribe the solution, allow the game drill, ask questions of the players and allow the players to come up with the answers. And Martin, spot on. I'm an absolute believer in that, so much so that I've designed sessions or drills for that matter, or small-sided games, and I didn't know the solution. Yeah. But I actually put it on the players, and when they couldn't do it, I said, geez, you guys are just dumb. How can you not do it? But meantime, I didn't have the solution. But it's trying to encourage them the whole time to come up with those solutions, because every scenario on a Saturday is going to be different, and they've got to find a way to break it.
Absolutely. So, I mean, this is just something that came in there. There was a few questions that came in, and one of them there obviously was from Doug. Doug, hopefully this is going to answer the question that you had in relation to that trade-off between drills and games. And the trend, particularly in Ireland at the minute, is that focus shifting towards game-based approach, and everyone has their opinions on it. But, traditionally those sessions are going to be, mostly drill-based. It's a lot of stop-start, working on core technicals, and the game-based stuff really was essentially team-run. That's what we were looking at really in terms of a game-based approach. The modern game now is pushing towards this game-based approach, but there is a balance to be had between drills and games. And I'm a real believer that you can't go fully one way or the other. You can't go all drills and you can't go all games, because you will lose, with all games, you lose the ability to give real core isolated technical feedback and repetition for improvement. You can't go all drill based because you're not going to replicate the game. So a mix is important there.
And I've had huge experience in that, where I've been, coming from South Africa, very much everything is drill based, and the more drills you do, the better coach you are.
Yeah.
And then, personally, I developed a style where I was all about game-based, so much so that it was too much. And we understood our roles and we knew what to do and everything, but we created 10, 12, 15 opportunities a game, but we could only finish 2 or 3 because our execution was so poor. So, and then it started getting better again when we really focused on the execution part, catch pass, for instance, or tackle tech in isolation, and then bring it all together. So I've gone sort of almost full circle on it, and I'm a massive believer in game-based approach, but also that you mustn't forget completely about the drill-based stuff.
Absolutely. So to give a clear roadmap on that, what we've just put together is basically a checklist on the drill front, because obviously the tendency now is to move away from drills towards games. But when we do come back to drills, and which they are useful in their extent and in their certain time frame, they're a really good way to work on those core skills and components, because they do provide repetition. And ultimately, we want to get guys comfortable in scenarios and comfortable in the game, but we really want to give them an opportunity to repetition things out. And that does come back to that principle of self-discovery and self-exploration, because if we give a guy no drills in all games, he might get an opportunity to pass in that particular scenario twice. And he might get, he'll have a choice between one of two ways to figure out what was better. If we give him an opportunity to get 50 touches on the ball in a drill before we start into that, gives him the opportunity to explore around with a different hand position, a different way to accelerate onto the ball, a different way to stand his hips, to work out for himself what he finds the best way to do that. And if not, that's when we intervene. But to have those correct, to have meaningful drills, we want to have these things checked off. So we want the drill to be representative. So this is a particularly valuable with set play as well, set piece play. Whatever drill you're doing, you should be able to pick it up off the floor and put it into a game scenario, and it should look right. Now, obviously, we'll be using pads and cones and stuff, but aside from that, the drill, to the most extent, you should be able to drop that directly into what you're doing in a game scenario.
100% agree on that, Joe. And I think during our backline attack, we had a slide where it showed, we've got the 6 attackers versus five defenders in a backline attack, backline versus backline. But within that, there's 3 blocks. This is your 2v1 space. This is your 3v2 space. This is your 5v3 space. That is connected to the drill activity.
Absolutely. So that's the representative part. Control is important. Something that, is often overlooked. We want to be clear on what intensity we want to do things at in a drill-based scenario. So, if we're doing that 4x4 handling drill we looked at, then we want to understand, are we doing it for tempo? Are we doing it to get used to handling the ball and match intensity? Are we doing it at a slow tempo to focus on technique? And that also comes back to how you explain that to the player. So understanding the tempo and controlling the tempo, having things meaningful. So connecting the activity to what's going to happen in the game is probably the most important thing about a drill. Look at that drill and really critically assess how relevant, how meaningful is this to what we're going to do in the game. And then finally, that one at the bottom there, so important. Are we coaching the drill, or are we coaching the player within the drill?
That for me, and there's loads of examples, but for me, that's the crux. Coaching the drill or the player within the drill. So many coaches, again, if you ask them, how did your session go? Oh, geez, no, that drill didn't work. That drill. The more the drill fails, the more coaching opportunity you have. Yeah. If the drill goes like clockwork and there's no mistake in the drill, what do you coach then? Why do you coach? Then the players can coach themselves. So you must design so that there's mistakes happening all the time. Otherwise, why do you coach? So don't coach the drill, coach the player within the drill. And just the point that I want to make on your checklist is a pet hate of mine will be passing. When guys say, no, we've got to improve our passing, but they do passing drill and the cones are 3 to 5 meters apart. That's not improving your passing. That's to make sure that no balls go down or whatever your reasons are. If you want to make guys better at passing, then put the cones 15 meters apart, 20 meters apart. And now you challenge them on passing. And coaches don't do it because a hell of a lot go wrong. Every second ball is on the floor and they feel they lose the coaching session. Not at all. That's actually when you coach. So I wouldn't use drills just to make the coach look good and everybody feel happy about themselves. You have to challenge.
Absolutely agree, 100%. This is just something we look at really, really briefly, just on a one-slide thing, which is just the role of pressure in training. Throughout all of our webinars, really, we speak about pressure because as the game moves on, everything in the game, whether it be set piece, attack, defense, is being built around pressure now. It's the trend in the modern game. So what is the role of pressure, in terms of pressure and skill sets and pressure and activities in our training session? So the thing we have to be really aware of is everything that we do in a game of rugby will be pressurized. Every line out, every scrum, every carry, every tackle, every pass, to some extent will be pressured in multiple or one ways. So we just have to keep that in mind when we do everything. So taking the pressure out is really important because, as it says there, when we remove the pressure, it allows the player to focus purely on improving that skill or that technique or that action. They're focusing 100% on getting that technique right. Then when we bring the pressure in, we're testing those abilities. So having an understanding of how to vary pressure between learning the skill and then pressure and then testing the skill is really important. And as Dan said, regressing that. So if we go straight into the game and we pressurize straight away, the ability to regress that to focus on the skill gives us the ability to try and really improve that in the area that is needed most. You won't know that
and then within that skill, you go and practice a certain technique.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we're going to look at that briefly here, but I mean, types of pressure, just really briefly, loads of different ways we can look at it. So time pressure. So, can we get the ball out of the ruck in 3 seconds? Can we get it from, if we get 6 guys in a line across the field for passing, can we get the ball from the touchline to the touchline in 15 seconds? Can we put defensive pressure on? So, a real aggressive blitz defense. Spacing pressure. So reducing the space between where we need to pass, reducing the space between the guy that needs to tackle so I have less time to react. Scenario pressure. So, applying that pressure and going, okay, here's the line that we're going to take. The scenarios we're 2 points down, this much time to play, and applying pressure by providing a realistic scenario, and then reward-based pressure. So, like I said, play 15v15 and say, the guys, if we have more than 3 drop balls, we're all doing 20 burpees. So applying pressure through that is a reward or to extend a punishment. Same thing, the team that wins gets to pick a punishment for the other team. So creating a reward as a form of pressure.
There's a lot of old school in you yet.
So, I mean, this is one thing we want to look at briefly, just as Dan said, in terms of working on the technique in isolation. So the whole approach is something that you'll see a lot. We thought we'd touch on it really briefly. So the first thing we want to do, for me, we can do a skills wheel to start. A lot of teams will start every training session with a passing drill, or start every session with a primer. That's fine, absolutely. That's getting you reacquainted with the skills. We do it very frequently. But once you move into that core body, we always want to get into that game-based scenario nice and early. So put them into an activity that pressurizes their skill set so we can assess what we have. So we've given an example here, which is the game-based parameter is we have to pass the ball 3 times before we get tipped. So a really, really basic parameter. We would have, a lot of people would have used something similar to this. A lot of the time it's a 2-pass rule, so we just, elaborate a little bit further to make it a little bit more difficult. So what are the things the players are going to have to do there to pass the ball 3 times? Well, they're going to have to hold their feet, attain really good depth, have good quality of passing, they're going to have to realign, and then they're going to have to communicate. So our challenge to do then as coaches is to figure out an activity that can work on all of those things at once that we can go to if we need to. So what we can do is we can put them into this game and see if they have the ability to do that consistently without intervention. If they don't, then that's when we come to the part. So we have a breakout drill. So breakout drills are really valuable things, especially when you have multiple coaches. So if you have 3 or 4 coaches and you get together before or well in advance of the session, we understand what the aim of the activity is, and then we can work out some breakout drills and say, listen, if we have an issue with this ability to realign, we're going to go to you for this breakout drill, and you're responsible for that. And that comes back to that co-coaching point that came up earlier.
But Joe, the same point there, if nothing goes wrong with the game, then you just make the game more difficult.
Absolutely.
And try and challenge the players to that. You don't have to, coaches think you have to do drills in every training session. There's some training sessions that you might not have to do that.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is just a really easy example. So if the skill set struggles in this scenario of trying to pass 3 times, we have a breakout drill prepared that's used to peel things back and go to that. So we've just taken that 4x4 drill and we've just brought the destination point forward. So we're putting that handling under pressure, and what we're looking for them to do is hold their feet, pass before the line, realign back, and come across. So just a really easy way to pressurize that skill set. And you can see there, it's 4 cones. It's really easy to set up, and just throwing that down takes 30 seconds before a session.
And again, for the coach to work on 1 or 2 key factors during that, not try and work on the whole pass.
Absolutely. So then you can go back to that whole. So what we really want to reinforce is we don't want to go whole game, part, take a water break, have a chat, go back in. When we break out for a breakout drill, we get back into that pressurized scenario nice and quickly, and we try and reinforce to them that what we've just done is given them that repetition and that familiarity with the skill that they need. So get them back in, say, listen, we're doing the same thing that we just did, but we have a defender this time. Just keep focused on that core skill, trust your skill set, real positive reinforcement where we can in terms of getting them clear that we've just done the skill set that they need. So I mean, just briefly, like, we'll just look at balance. So there's a lot of things we have to balance in our training session. You know, there's the 4 areas there. You know, as Dan said to you before, the game is moving quite tactical now. So, you know, Dan, those things will be, you know, technical can be coached through tactical, and physical and mental to an extent.
Yeah, right? They stop pro sides, you know, different levels, different things. Again, we probably can't afford it, but they stop pro sides that doesn't want to worry about any technical during a session. They just want the intensity as high as they can, train at a rate of knots, and try and improve the players tactically. Technically, they'll fix later. Other coaches like yourselves probably don't have that luxury, so you've got to try and bring all of that into it, but it doesn't have to be 25% of this, 25% of this. Training session will differ on a weekly basis in that scenario, whether it's 70-30, 80-20, 50-50, whatever the case might be.
Absolutely. So that's just a little illustration there in terms of, you know, the 4 things that we want to consider in terms of balance. So just a quick note there on chaos. You know, it's something that's coming up really frequently in coaching now, which is that, you know, the game is becoming, you know, more open plan for some teams. Some teams are getting more structured. And the way that you beat those structured teams is being able to be playing in chaos. The point that we just thought we'd illustrate in terms of you know, being a coach that can represent that is, you know, we want our players to be comfortable playing in this chaos. So the tendency, though, for us as coaches a lot of the time is to put in these real rigid plans and structures to our training sessions so that we have complete knowledge and control. We understand what can go wrong. We understand what we're looking for. The measure of us as good coaches is being comfortable in that chaos. If we can, as Dan said, run through the drill, give hot feedback, improve things on the run, and make a difference and get what we want achieved without stemming the flow, that's a measure of us as good coaches.
That's probably the biggest challenge for coaches still. Yeah. The game is chaotic, but coaches are very like that, you know. So we've got to get comfortable to coaching that chaos as coaches and give that, again, that individual feedback, give collective feedback, intervene at the right times, all of that.
So having a real effort consciously to be comfortable in chaos is really valuable. So as we move towards the end there, we just wanted to talk briefly about having your session representative to what the game feels like. So obviously these are at a high standard. They're the median statistics for the 2019 World Cup, just on a few areas. So, you know, they're not meant to be a Bible or anything here. They're just to give you a clear picture on what the average game looked like at the top level. So just important things there in terms of, you know, how many passes in a game. You know, 128, 129 passes in a game, 15 turnovers conceded, rucks and kicks, you know, tackle and offload there as well. But just to give you a perspective on that. So what we wanted to use those stats to illustrate was, if we just take these as given, so if we take these as a given for the league we're coaching at, so obviously you probably reduce some things, increase a few other things depending on your level. If we take these stats as given, it's a really easy way for us to look at our session and go, are we training on par, if not above par, with what we want in the game? So, you know, if there's 128 passes in a game, are we making that many passes or attempting that many or more passes in a training session? If not, are we really fulfilling what we need to be doing? Have we practiced transitioning from 15 different turnovers in a game and what that looks like for us? Have we coached those habits? Have we prepared for receiving or returning that many kicks? So it's obviously not a real technical point because, you know, those stats are not going to be relevant to every level. But it's a good way for us to just reinforce that. Just take a game if you have it and just count how many rucks or how many passes there are in one game that you video. And just to give a real clear look at it. And that can just be a really easy thing for you to look at and go, am I really recreating that in training and giving a representative picture through that? So that really comes back to that training like you play principle. Something we thought we'd touch on briefly was one of the biggest considerations on training like you play is, you know, there's 78 rucks in a game. Does that mean we have to do 78 rucks a week? You know, there's 120 tackles. Does that mean we have to do 120 tackles a week? The thing that we would agree on here between myself and Dan, and again, we're no experts on this, but in terms of our experience so far, is this is where periodization comes in, as it was brought up at the start. Periodizing your contact plan is probably the most important piece of planning you'll do, because having, you know, capability in contact, it really comes back to how familiar you are with those pictures, you know, at the ruck and the tackle, understanding, you know, what's occurring and what I have to do about that. So that's your cue and your action. What's the picture and what's my reaction? It's getting confident through having previous experience. So you've been in that scenario before and you've reacted to it. Even if you've done it wrong, you know what it feels like to do it wrong. And then your physical capability. So your ability to hit a ruck with speed and aggression comes back to your strength. So that comes back to comes back to understanding that when we periodise our contact plan, we want to understand that the capability of doing these things comes back to those 4 points.
For me, it also comes back to a little bit of tradition, and I take it back in my day, and it hasn't changed much, If you play for the Blue Bulls, you do contact every day. If you play for Western Province, you might do contact 20 minutes, If you play for, and this is my perception, if you play for Munster, you've got to do a lot more contact than when you play for Leinster. Not to say that it's not effective, but it's how I know with Stuart Lancaster, having listened to him before, there's not a lot of contact being done. Full on, man on. If you're coaching clubland, some clubs really say, "No, geez, coach, we've got to go at it on Tuesday night." There's so many different beliefs, but I think it's the word controlled and get out of it what you want to get out of it, rather than just it's a free for all, is quite important when it comes down to those contact areas.
Yeah, so I mean, when we put that into a clear plan to an extent, what we want to really do with our contact zone relative to the game is we want to get confident with our contact early. So we want to get confident mentally that we know how to experience those scenarios, we know how to go through our processes, we know how to stick our head in there. We build that high intensity and high contact into our preseason wherever possible. Because in that preseason period, we don't like to talk about it, but with contact comes the risk of injury, and especially with smaller squad sizes, it's a major consideration that we can't overlook. So getting that high intensity, high contact in a preseason doesn't just build confidence, but it does give us some safety. But it also gets, high contact games are really, really fatiguing. So having those high contact games are a good way to build up that match fitness as we go through the start of the year. And then as we move through the season, what we really want to do is, we'll know this, especially for the coaches that work at a performance level. When you get to those cup competitions, those shortened weeks where you have to really utilize your time effectively because of how fatigued you are, you want to be slowly progressing as the season goes on to bringing your contact from long, high intensity, high contact games into small 4 or 5 minute blocks where we just go back to making sure we get our habits right. So, the contact in the preseason might be a 12-minute block of 15v15, full tackle, full breakdown, full carry, getting that right. Where when you get to that sort of, quarterfinal, semi-final week, all you want is a quick 4 or 5 minute skills wheel of getting our foot in the right position, getting our head positioning right, snapping our hands through, and just reinforcing positive habits rather than bruising bodies.
Yeah, and it's modifying as well. You might have struggled on pick and goes during the weekend, so you're going to do a 4-minute block on pick and go defense or pick and go attack. You might play an activity, tactical game, but the breakdown is live. Because we struggled with the breakdown, or we want to keep emphasizing how important the breakdown is for speed of ball. So the tackle might just be touch, but the first arriving player can contest. Those sort of things to modify the contact, but to have it in there.
So, I mean, just to make a point on that, to make things kind of definable, I guess, if you go back to what we said when we talked about forward play, if I'm coaching the scrum, we'll say, listen, 6 reps only. If 1 goes down, 2 goes down, we're not doing them again because we want to manage our load. Same thing here. If you need to build in a little bit of contact into a certain late part in your season, easiest way to do it is just go sit down with medical staff if you can, or even just as a coaching staff, and go, we're going to do 6 reps. Those 6 reps are going to be no longer than 45, 60 seconds in length. We're going to stop it there, and then we're going to reset. So managing that. So there's no reason why you can't bring in this contact. We're not saying don't do contact the week of a game or don't do it in the competition phase. It's managing it relative to that, because the trap we can fall into is, the longest pieces of play, depending on your level. When's the last time you saw a piece of play go on for kind of more than 2 minutes without a stoppage of some kind? So managing that load relative to the game is something really important for us.
Look, I know there's coaches that really part of their warm-up has got big contact elements in. I've done it this year, even when Thursday night, last 10 minutes of training on a Thursday night before Saturday's game, contact, Eddie Jones, Warren Gatlin, they famous for big contact sessions day off or day before before a test match. So it really depends. And again, your gut feel as a coach. I don't think there's a system that you're going to start at the start of the season and say we're never going to do contact. I think it's going to differ.
Absolutely. So it's relative to the game, obviously, but it is something important. So, look, it's the last real big point we're going to touch on, which is that mental skills block, because it is one of the things that it's a real grey area with how we coach. The mental skills bit, we know how to coach the technicals and tacticals. We've learned how to communicate properly. Mental skills are a real tough part to coach because it's incredibly tough for you to see whether you've gotten through to a player or not. It's incredibly tough to see whether you have developed the mental skills of the player because it's in their mind. So we can't underestimate the fact that matches are extremely mentally demanding. So that's that quote by Willie John there in the middle, just in terms of how tough, how hard you're going to have to work in games. And look, it's depending on the level. Not all games are going to be like that. There are games where you just got to get through it. There's games where you're not very optimistic about them. But we're preparing our players all the time. Michael Jordan was the Last Dance documentary is all over everywhere now, and the big thing coming out of that is he played every game like it was his last. And not every player is going to be like that. But if we flip that to a coaching extent, we should be coaching our players as if the game that we're playing, is that cup final. We're preparing them for that cup final game all the time, preparing them for that tough scenario all the time, so that when we do get to those, hopefully to those bigger games, it's not a massive change in intensity and focus from what we've done before, because that just creates uncertainty mentally. So I mean,
with promotion relegation, there's enough mental stress teaching.
Exactly. So, I mean, how do we prepare them for this? I mean, really briefly, mental skills and training. If we can make our players make a decision every 30 seconds at a minimum, that's a really representative scenario. Every 30 seconds, players should be making decisions. And that means, instead
whether
of...
he's on the ball or off the ball, for that matter.
Absolutely. And that means in a drill scenario, if we have 30 guys, can we split that 30-guy drill into two 15-man drills to improve how often guys are making decisions? Can we rotate and play 3 teams of reduced numbers instead of 2 teams of 15 where guys are lingering around? Can we push players to an exertion level on par above the game? So, we hear train harder than you play. That develops mental skills. We challenge mental toughness through the way you stagger it. So if we're going to do a high-intensity S&C block, can we do high intensity followed by a core skill, high intensity followed by a core skill, to really challenge them mentally to focus in after a hard block? And then at the end there, if we do have to put guys through a real tough fitness block, which is part of the game, you have to push them to a high intensity. If we do have to do that, get guys working together and put them in that scenario where they have to communicate. I've done real military style workouts before, get them in and suffering these things together and really in compact areas where they have to communicate and stuff. Why have them running, suicide sprints all the time where they're not going to be doing it together and they're doing it in 2s or 3s? Kind of doing that thing together really, really builds a mental toughness with the player. I mean, we might send these out, Dan, at some point, just so I know we're tight for time, but just, the easy examples, we might just flick them out in terms of, I'll just show the short one, Dan, just in terms of, training like we play. Like, there's a training scenario with a set piece, and there's a game-based scenario with a set piece that we showed in our line-out webinar. So having training represented the game, there's a really easy example of it. We might fling out the one of yours, Dan, which is a minute longer. But I mean, just in terms of,
this is just team training against each other, and then we're going to go into the game. There's loads of examples, but players working on their positioning, their effectiveness, coaches running around, trying to give individual players feedback or questioning through it. And then come Saturday, they look to play as they trained.
So, I mean, there's that exact scenario again. And I know we don't all have the luxury of having, 30, 45 players to replicate this all the time, but having the ability to replicate at least something representative, even if we have to do it in reduced numbers, I always say you're better off reducing your numbers and creating a relative recognizable picture in one zone rather than stretching your numbers and creating an unrealistic picture on a more game-centered role. So really simple. If we have 15v15, let's do a kickoff scenario and run at each other. If we only have, 18 guys, let's do 9v9 in a reduced grid rather than trying to stretch these 9v9 guys into that kickoff scenario. So, I mean, listen, Dan, is there anything you want to summarise that with as a takeaway, the core message you want to...
Well, look, I think, no right or wrong. Be true to yourself. Because if you're not true to yourself, how do you expect the players to follow you and be true to you? We're not saying get away from drills, but certainly the game tactically and so on is moving more into game-based coaching. When you coach a drill, really coach coach the player within it and make the player better in that. Don't try and make the drill work.
Absolutely. So look, thanks everyone for joining us again. We really appreciate that. Hopefully, it's a slightly more, there's no kind of route 1, route 2 for defining how we coach. It's very much a flow, a very much kind of an over and back way of discussing it. So hopefully we gave some clarity on a few different areas. As usual, we've built a community where we're on average getting 20 new people into every webinar every week, and obviously we want to share that experience with as many people as possible. So please do any key takeaways, any interesting thoughts, any sort of food for thought that you have from this evening. Please do share it out. Our Twitter is there. Sorry.
Any topics that you want us to discuss or facilitate, please send it through to us. By all means, we just here to enjoy ourselves and to create a bit of discussion. And if you come across then, to Ireland or of people in Ireland, please just make them aware of us, both player development and on coach development. And thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. So listen, the email addresses are there. Feel free to send me an email, particularly if there's anything you want to discuss or anything you need, resource-wise, or anything we can help you with. Tag us on Twitter. Our personal Twitter and our academy Twitter is there. Please do get in touch. And as we said, stay involved, stay in touch, and hopefully we'll see all of you in the next one. The details on next week will be released in the coming days.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Dan.
On your question there, Martin, just send me an email.
Yeah, just if you have any further questions, anything we can do for you, just send us an email. We'll be back in touch as soon as we can. So listen, thanks very much everyone for joining us. Hopefully you got a little something out of it, and we'll hope we see you all again soon. Thanks for that, Dan.
Cheers. Thanks, John. Keep well.
You too,
safe. Bye-bye.